Hello. This is my Solitaire playthrough of Cataclysm, A Second World War, specifically the Great Patriotic War scenario that pits Germany against the Soviets between 1941 and 1944. So as you may have guessed, this is a game about World War II. The grand campaign for this game has 7 powers. That's 3 democracies, 3 fascists, and the Communist Soviet Union. It pits them against each other across Europe, across the Pacific, and you can see the Pacific battlefield down here, though we won't be using that in this game. And it also has some interesting aspects that make it a little different than other World War II games. For instance, you have to manage your military, but you do so at a very high level. A army unit in this game is something like 30 divisions, so it's not like you're moving around individual divisions or even commanding individual armies so much as just moving huge masses of men and material around the map. As befitting a game that's really putting you in the chair of the leadership, not the military command necessarily. You also have to manage the economy of your nation. So this refers to basically how geared up for war your economy is. As you go from civilian to rearmament to mobilization up to total war, your military spending gets more and more effective. But at the same time, you face more and more dissent on the home front. And this could potentially lead to a devastating collapse in stability, which could knock you out of the war altogether. So there's a really interesting aspect there, too. There's also a political aspect to this game. This is simulated at a pretty high level, but what's going on here is that each country has a certain effectiveness, which tells them how many dice they get for certain political actions. So in this case, we have the Soviet Union with an effectiveness of 2, though that's a little more complicated, which we'll go into in a second. And we have the German effectiveness of 3 for the most part. However, once the Germans advance to total war, Hitler's control becomes a little less solid, and their effectiveness declines to 2. Anyway, the short review of this game is that I quite like it. It combines, the World War II historical experience with a real sandboxy element. There's a real Eurogame kind of feel to this because you don't have odds tables, you don't have a lot of DRMs like many those are dice roll modifiers like many war games have. So compared to many grand strategic war games, which have you commanding the country from a bird's eye perspective, Cataclysm is maybe a little less complicated than those games. That said, it's still a pretty complicated game. I'm not going to capture all the rules in this playthrough or probably any other. To really learn this game, it might help to watch this video, but you're going to want to look at the rules, which are on GMT's website. The playbook is also excellent for learning kind of how the game flows. And so I'm going to work on the assumption that you either basically know how the game works or basically don't care and just want to see stuff blow up. Either one is fine with me. So, with regard to my understanding of the rules, I am likely going to make some mistakes. This is a fiddly game. It's hard to remember every little bit, and if I do make a mistake, I'll try to go back and correct it. No promises, though. So, and my overall plan for this series is to play increasingly complex scenarios. So, this is the Great Patriotic War, arguably the least complex scenario of the 7 that come with Cataclysm. The most complex would be the full war that goes from 1933 through possibly up to 1950, whereas this scenario only goes from 1941 to 1944, from the end of Case Bleu, the fall of France, to the invasion of the French beaches at D-Day. A period where Germany's attention was mainly focused on the incipient conflict with the Soviets, and the Soviets were fighting for dear life in this time as well. So the Great Patriotic War is just kind of a slugfest between the Germans and the Soviets here. Slugfest in that it's a real zero-sum game, unlike the main campaign, which has a three-way standoff. It also doesn't involve much naval operations. The naval side of things can be a little bit complicated, a little bit unintuitive. That's not an issue here. While Germany and the Soviet Union both start with one fleet representing a battleship-based flotilla, those fleets aren't going to be seeing too much action, most likely. We could have the Germans occupy the Baltic Sea or the Gulf of Bithynia, or perhaps the Russians could do the same. However, I'm not sure it'll really come to that. In my test games, the fleets have not been terribly important. Mainly, it's going to be these troops and these planes that are going to be doing most of the fighting. So, one of these army units represents a lot of mana material. Something like 3 divisions in one army here. One air force, I think, is said to represent like 1,000 planes. Okay, so these are big, high-level units. They don't represent specific military formations. They represent a lot of military units altogether. And that's the scale this game kind of takes. So this particular scenario takes place only over 2 turns. First, the 1941 to 1942 turn, and then it will continue on to the 1943 to 1944 turn. Sometime during 1944, these offensives are going to happen, and then D-Day will be upon us, and the scenario is over as soon as the Allies invade France, which is not actually represented in the game in this scenario. I should also mention that of this map of Europe, Western Europe is basically out of play except for Benelux, which is occupied by Germany. France should be under German occupation. UK should be under, British occupation, and maybe with some Americans there. But in this case, those are all out of play. France is out of play. UK and Ireland are out of play. Iberia is out of play. Switzerland, Italy, all out of play. What is in play is Germany and the countries in between Germany and the Soviet Union. So Finland, Baltics, Poland. The Germans currently control Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, and Romania. Interestingly, the countries of the Baltics, the Balkans, are still in play. So Germany can expand to Yugoslavia if they really want to, or Albania, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, and even Persia. The Middle East, besides Persia, is out of play as well. So it's a less nuanced game playing one of these simpler scenarios compared to playing the whole campaign, which takes quite a while and has a lot of diplomatic negotiation involved in it. So, I want to go over basically our protagonists before we start with the main playthrough. Germany is starting in a strong position. Victory points in this game, here I'll show you the display, are tracked by the number of cubes, or are given by the number of cubes that you have occupying countries outside of your home area. Germany doesn't receive any points for its own 5 territories here, but it receives points for occupying Benelux, Poland, Czechoslovakia, blah, blah, blah. So that's 7 countries that are under German control, effectively. Finland up here isn't garrisoned by German troops, so it might flip at some point, but it also is a possible location for a German invasion of northern Russia or Leningrad. The Soviets are in a position where they control only one country. Their VP is at 1, while the Germans are at 7. So the Soviets start at a significant point disadvantage, though they have some numerical advantage to start with. So for Germany, victory is achieved by either causing the Soviet surrender or by, after D-Day, having more points than the Soviets. And the Soviets win otherwise if they have more points than if they have more points than the Germans, or if they cause German surrender by seizing German core territories, or if it's a tie, the communists actually win according to the rules. Though it would be close. So the German situation here is that the economy has been geared toward mobilization. We're not at total war yet, so the whole of the economy hasn't been dedicated to the war effort. However, quite a lot of resources are going into mobilization. So while Germany is considered steady right now in its stability, it might not stay that way. It probably won't, because there will be, even if Germany is super effective in the battlefield, it'll have home front problems, and these home front checks may cause it to lose stability that way. If your country is at any of steady, wavering, or unstable, it's pretty much fine. But the last step here, collapse, is disaster for your country. It's probably the end of the game for you if you collapse. It would be possible to survive it if you don't surrender. We'll cross that bridge when it comes to it, though. As for the German order of battle, they have an air force in Poland, an army in Poland, and a tank army in Romania, as well as a air force in Romania. They also control this minor army. Well, they don't control it because it's under Romanian control. This will never leave Romania, but it could defend Romania if the Soviets were to attack it. And Romania is an interesting province here, an interesting country, because it has a natural resource all to itself, a permanent one, that the Soviets can use for the whole game. The Germans can use for the whole game. The Germans also have industrial resources in their home territories of the Rhineland and Berlin. Furthermore, they have two temporary or limited resources. That's Benelux and Poland. These are one-shot resources. So they're limited resources, which means that you only get to use them up once. However, it may be smart to use them sooner rather than later, even if that's not the most efficient move, because we'll see that, there's only 2 turns in this game, so even if they are permanent resources, they wouldn't make that much difference compared to limited resources. And as for Germany's strategic plan, they would win just by holding on to the current front lines. There isn't actually a state of war with the Soviets yet. If they do that, if they just build up their strength and try and take over other countries, the Soviets will definitely build up their own strength and try to invade as soon as possible, as soon as practical, because Soviets are at such a disadvantage, and the German high command, is pretty clear on what the Soviets' motivation is going to be. As for the Soviet situation, the Soviets have a lot of dudes at arms, but they're all pretty low tech. They don't have any tank armies, which are the second step, the upgraded army. They have quite a few fighters based in the Baltics, in Belarusia, and the Ukraine. These are going to provide some well-needed defense if they have to soak up German attacks. So they will come in handy. Something that's also interesting about this scenario is that the Action Cup, which is what the chits are drawn from, contains a... Oh, I thought it contained a Soviet fortress. Maybe I was wrong about that. Anyway, doesn't really matter. Oh yeah, the Soviets have a fortress here in their production holding box. So they'll probably have a chance to plop this fortress down sometime this turn. That makes a strong defensive position. And believe me, the Soviets are going to need that strong defense because it's likely the Germans will have the drop on them. The Soviet economy is getting better than it was in the 1930s, but it's not up to full production yet. Once the Soviets go to total war, they'll get another resource marker in the Urals here. The Urals are a remote area that can't even be touched by Germans. They currently have 2 industrial resources and a natural resource in the Caucasus. They need to hold on to these for dear life. It might even be possible for the Soviets to expand into southern Europe. They could hit Persia, they could hit Turkey, both of which have limited resources. And Yugoslavia is within reach of the Germans, and that's another limited resource. So that may come to pass if the Germans or the Soviets have some free resources. They might try to take over some of those countries for the points and the resources. But, the priority is on this fight to death, really, so there may not be time for such distractions. The Soviet Union politically is in a state of, let's say, transition. Currently, it's in a state of political purges. This gives no penalty to political actions other than diplomacy, but Soviets don't do a lot of that. But it gives a significant penalty, a -1 DRM, to all military, to all combat. So that is really bad. If the Soviets stay in political purges, they are going to get invaded and surrender, full stop. There is no way they're going to win battle after battle and stay viable. Soviets are going to want to shift as soon as possible, whenever they have a political action, over to military reforms. This gives a penalty to political actions, but thankfully no penalties to military. And they're going to be doing a lot of fighting here. Soviets currently need to make up 3 countries worth of ground. So if they could capture Finland, Poland, and Romania, they'd be in pretty good shape. But that's going to be a tall order because the Germans have quite the opposite idea. Another interesting bit of the Soviet Union is that while they have effectiveness 2, they get to roll 3 dice for stability checks. This makes them a little more buoyant if they're going to be invaded and taking a lot of stability hits. They also have an easier time with propaganda because they get to roll 3 dice. Propaganda is what you use to boost your stability. So the Soviets, they aren't a pushover in the way Hitler might have thought. Not in this game, at least. However, the Germans are quite a real threat here, and well, we're going to see some action, I'm sure. So as for the general strategy here, I'm thinking the historical analogs are probably likely. The Soviets are going to smash into, with their high-tech troops, into the Russian positions here in the southern part of the front and the northern part of the front, the Baltics and Leningrad. However, there is this very important caveat. All of the Soviet home territories are restricted terrain. This means that the Germans can only stack 1 land unit and 1 air unit at any time within the restricted terrain. You also can't trace supply through restricted terrain. So if the German units start in restricted terrain and take an operation further into the restricted terrain, that's going to have them at a significant supply penalty, which could be pretty nasty. The Soviets have an ability called General Winter, makes sense, which lets them simply ignore the restricted penalty. So the Soviets could do this. They could stack two dudes in Belarusia, where the Germans could not. However, the Germans will have the ability to play logistics tokens. These are units that can't move, but they plop in a place like a restricted terrain like this one, and they make it not restricted effectively. So a couple logistic units can go a long way in this invasion. Remains to be seen whether the Germans will have time to actually do that. So that's most of the strategic, at least the very high level strategic dilemmas that both sides face. Note also that most of these territories, these spaces, are clear terrain. Leningrad and Finland are adverse territory, but the European plain extends from the Rhineland all the way through Moscow and beyond, and it's a great place for tanks to operate. Tanks don't get a bonus if they're in adverse territory, but there's an armor superiority bonus if you're in clear territory, and that'll become pretty effective, pretty decisive here, because it's an extra dice, or a dice taken away from the opponent who doesn't have armor superiority, which can make quite a difference. Air superiority is going to be very important too. Both sides are going to want to keep parity with each other's fighters. If you don't have air superiority, the enemy is going to get an extra die, and it's going to get ugly for the invader of either side without adequate air cover. So I think that's pretty much it for the overview of this scenario. Now I believe we can get started with the 1941 through 42 turn. This turn starts with, both sides gain a flag. So the Soviets get their flag from being at political purges. Germans have Knight of the Long Knives, giving them 2 flags due to Hitler's ability to get things done by killing everyone he doesn't like. So, we now have the production phase. The Soviets have 3 resources, as I mentioned, and they will go first because they're at lower effectiveness over here. The Soviets are going to have up to 6 builds. 3 resources times 2 builds per resource gives 6 builds. But the Soviets are probably going to want to... Well, it's a tough one here. They could put it all into builds. They could build 2... It's 2 builds per tank upgrade, so they could build 2 tank upgrades in an army and a fighter. Might be the best option here, just simply because they're going to need all the warm bodies they can get. The other option is to spend one of those resources on an offensive, which would require buying 1 less tank, but would allow for the Soviets to go on the attack, which will be very necessary. I think we are going to ultimately say that they will buy 1 offensive, because they really do need to make up a lot of lost ground here. So they'll buy 1 offensive. You know, I'm going to go with 2 tanks just because, just switch things up a little. My test game went disastrously for the Soviets when they bought that offensive. So, okay, so 2 builds for 1 tank, 2 builds for the second tank, 1 build for a plane, 1 build for an army. So that's 6 builds altogether. They also get to reserve 1 token. 1 chit here. They'll reserve the flag. The flag is going to let them change posture, which is going to be critical if they want to, win battles, which might be pretty important here. So we'll send these units all to the Action Cup. Now they're in here in the Action Cup. As for Germany, 3 flags, so a lot of political maneuverability. They have 1, 2, 3 resources, so 6 builds. They also have these resources that can be used up in Benelux and in Poland. I think we are going to go ahead and use the one from Poland. That means that Poland will no longer have an industrial resource. That's not the worst thing in the world, though, because it means that if the Germans capture Poland, they won't be able to... if the Soviets capture Poland after the Germans have stripped its resources, well, maybe not that big of a loss. Anyway, so they have a total of 8 builds, or 6 builds and 1 offensive, or perhaps 4 builds and 2 offensives. Let's see. They're definitely going to want all the warm bodies they can get, so 2 armies are in order. Oh, my game seems to have frozen up. What the hell's going on here? Okay, great. So that's 1 army. I'm definitely going to need a fighter. And let's make it 2 tanks. Because we can always if a unit takes a hit and becomes, if a tank takes a hit and becomes an infantry again, we can always re-upgrade it to a tank, which might come in handy. So that's 6 builds, and they'll buy an offensive too. That offensive may really come in handy here. And I think they are going to actually reserve this offensive for an aggressive attack, much like the real-life Operation Barbarossa. So, the Soviet player would not be happy to see that the Germans have reserved an offensive, which means very likely the first thing that's going to happen in this turn is a German offensive. And I think we can guess where the Germans are going with that. The fascists have an ability to do surprise attacks. This gives them an extra, gives the enemy a penalty because of surprise. Oh, sorry, it's, yeah, it's a penalty due to surprise, I believe. Let me check the rules, though. This is one of those examples where... the fiddly rules are actually pretty darn important. So for one fight, the Soviets are going to suffer a penalty of -1 to their combat. That could be a big deal. Okay. So what are we going to do here? We are going to move on to the main phase, the action phase, and send these Soviet units, these German units, all to the force pool. So that's 3 flags, an army, a fighter, 2 tanks. Send that to the Action Cup. So the Action Cup is now full of Germans and Soviet chits, as well as the crisis markers that are in every turn, a Civil War resolution that won't probably make much difference here, 2 home front markers, which actually could be pretty important because they could represent a big hit to stability. And, well, that's that. So, oh yeah, and I was going to delete this resource in Poland because it was used up by the German war machine. So here we are, spring 1941, and it's time for a German sneak attack. The Soviets would like to go. They would interrupt if they could, but the Germans have higher effectiveness. So the Soviets are going to suffer a penalty. The penalty is that they have -1 to their combat score. Combined with the surprise attack, this is going to make the Soviets pretty darn weak in the first battle, which is historically plausible, but it's going to be pretty nasty for them. So, let's do this offensive here. We are going to send this offensive, which gives us 2 military actions as Germany. We are going to throw this offensive at... Let's see. It's just a question of where I want to invade. I could go into the Baltics. That's not Soviet home territory, but it's a very useful step to it. I could go into Belarus or the Ukraine, which are Soviet home territories. They're not very useful by themselves, but taking Soviet territory will give points and will hurt the Soviet morale overall. I think we are going to say, let's go into... Yes, let's attack north into the Baltics. This isn't the most damaging attack I could make, but it puts me in the best position as Germany. So, we'll use this offensive to go north. I'm going to use 1 military action. I'm not going to augment this one because I want to use the second military action for more vicious attacks, while the Soviets are still at political purges and the military is in a dire state. So, Germans are going to roll 2 dice for air superiority. Soviets are going to roll 2 and then subtract 2 from their high score. That's going to hurt. So Germans roll 6. Perfect. Soviets roll 6, but that's -2. So that's 4. Let's see. Oh, and realistically, the Soviets should be sending in a support plane here. Germans don't have any other air forces that could support, but this would be a pretty clearly a wise idea to send in the plane. So Soviets here have an option or two. They could retreat these planes. Then the planes would be saved, but the Germans would have uncontested air superiority. If they take the hit by removing one of these planes, then there will be no air superiority in this fight, which gives the Russians something of a fighting chance. So I think the Soviets are going to, they'll make the best of future turns by saving these fighters. So the fighters are going to retreat out of the Baltic, back into Belarus and to Leningrad here. This Soviet troop is dead meat, unfortunately. So we're going to roll 3 as Germans because we are superiority. Soviets will roll 2 -2. 3 as Germans, that's a 6. 2 Soviet, That's a 5. Minus 2 is 3. 6 divided by 3, rounded down, is 2. So the Soviets have to absorb 2 hits here. However, they only have 1 step of land unit to actually take the hit. That's going to suck for them. That's considered a disaster for the Soviet Union and a triumph for the Germans. So the Germans are going to take that triumph as a flag for a political action in the future. Soviets will lose their troop here. They will also lose control of the Baltic states, which become German. It's another VP for the Germany, and Soviets are in a 0 VP. That's ugly. And what's more, we still have 1 military action from this offensive. We're not going to get the surprise bonus. We are going to get the military purges bonus, though. Yeah. Now, I would be remiss to not just attack Leningrad. That puts me within striking distance of Moscow. It should effectively panic the Soviets. Well, the Soviets are also me, so I guess I won't be panicked, but you get the idea. Invading from Romania is also appealing, because we could maybe do some damage to the Ukrainian forces, maybe peel away one of these planes. If they did really well, they could kill both the enemy air forces. I guess that's pretty unlikely. So, I think it's going to be, these commandos are going to go and, well, they're not commando, they have air support. They're going to go ahead and invade Leningrad. So, that's going to be a troop, and the plane's going to come into support. The Red Air Force will also come in here and support. Notice that the Soviets can stack 2 planes in this restricted territory, whereas the Germans are restricted to only 1 plane, 1 air unit, and 1 land unit for each restricted terrain. That is, unless they can put logistics into play, which isn't going to happen just yet. Cool. So, let's see if they can defeat the Reds at Leningrad. Air combat is going to be 2 for the Germans and 2 minus 1 for the Soviets. 5 for the Germans. Ooh, 3 minus 1 makes 2. So that means that the planes are going to suffer 2 hits. They can reduce that to 1 hit by retreating 1 and only losing 1 of the planes. Still pretty ugly for the poor Soviets, though. So let's get rid of 1 of the planes, and the other one is going to retreat to somewhere convenient. I guess Smolensk is probably the best because it can support attacks against. It can support defense of Moscow, of Belarusia. I could put it in Moscow. That would defend the northern territory a little bit better. No, let's leave it in Smolensk. Okay, so now Germans are in a very strong position for the ground combat in Leningrad. They're going to get 3 because of air superiority dice. They're going to roll 3D. The Germans, I'm sorry, I keep confusing those two. The Soviets are going to roll 1 die because they don't have any land forces there. They just have a token local defense force that isn't represented in the map. They're going to be at -1 because of the military reforms, or because the military reforms are not happening yet. But they're going to be at +1, on the other hand, from the adverse terrain that they're fighting in, because Leningrad is more defensible as terrain than some of its neighbors. That's going to put the Soviets at 0 DRM, so 1 die, and Germans get 3. German 3, they roll a 5. Soviets roll a 3. Ouch. So that's a clear defeat for the Soviets. They aren't going to have a disaster because they didn't have any land units there to suffer that blow. The Germans also didn't quite manage to triumph, but the Germans did manage to conquer Leningrad, which is pretty bad news for the beleaguered Soviets, who are now at -1 VP, while the Germans are at 9 victory points. To make matters worse for these Soviets, they have to disband their fleet here because there's nowhere for it to go. It can't retreat to Finland or the Baltics; those are under German control. It can't retreat to here because there's no local base. There's no port within range of it. Can't get up to the Barents Sea. It's bad scene because Finland has two coasts: the Bithynia coast and the Barents Sea coast. So losing this ship. So that was a devastating opening blow by the Germans. It remains to be seen if the Soviets can actually recover from this, as happened historically. The saving grace for the Soviets is that now the Baltics and Poland are wide open, so they might be able to impair. Well, they could still supply these troops navally, so I don't know. They might be able to surround them somehow, though. Surrounding isn't a big thing in this game, so I don't know. Like there isn't some envelopment mechanic or anything like that. So that's the German turn. The Germans would love to go again to play their reserve, but they can't interrupt. They can't interrupt after they just played. So there we are. Okay. Now, what are the Soviets going to do in response here? The Soviets, and I should add the counters to actually indicate there's war here. So it's a communist-fascist war between gray, the Germans, and red, the Soviets. That means that we're not global war. If this was a longer scenario, that would trigger a countdown toward the end of the game. So I'll just put this here. It doesn't really matter because the game will end in 1944 or 43 if it doesn't end this turn, because it is looking kind of dark for these poor Soviets. Okay, so the Soviets had to take a stability test that I forgot to do for the Baltic states because they lost so badly it was a disaster. So I'll do that. They passed that one. They also have to pass a stability test for Leningrad because that's loss of home territory. Oh, they fail that one. So the Soviets move to wavering. If they move to collapse, that's probably GG for them. So, big problem. Big problem. Yeah. And what are the Soviets going to do in response? They really have to play that flag. If they don't, and the next thing is the next action is a offensive, that's probably game over for them. Moscow at least would be in serious jeopardy. It would be great if that fortress turned up so we could defend Moscow better, but you never know because that's somewhere in the Action Cup and we're drawing at random. So the Soviets are definitely going to use. Oh, and the Germans grabbed a flag from their successful invasion of Soviet home territory here. No, the flag was from their triumph in the Baltic states. They would have another flag from hitting Leningrad, but they're out of flags. Okay. Soviets are going to play a flag for political action. The two choices here are to move from mobilization to total war. Not a bad idea. Total war would get us, as the Soviets, another industry in the Urals. It would move conversion of the conversion rate from resources to military actions, or builds, resources to builds, and offensives to military actions, would go from 1 to 2 up to 1 to 3. That'd be effectively 12 builds for the next turn, which is pretty darn good. It would expand the Soviet force pool. It would also have the effect of making home front checks even nastier. If the Soviets fail a home front check, and they fail it really badly with a score of less than 1, they would collapse. They would lose 2 stability points and be in a state of disarray. and likely would have to surrender. Well, I guess surrender isn't necessarily likely at this point, but it could happen here. So I think the Soviets they really have to. What are they gonna do? I think they're gonna have to use this political action, as unfortunate as it is for them. They really have to use this political action for a switch to military reforms. The Germans can probably do maneuvers with their flag just after this, so yeah. As the Germans attack, if the Germans attempt to attack Moscow to Leningrad, though, they'll be at reduced supply, so they would get one of these suckers, limited supply. That reduces the German DRM. That's a DRM against the Germans. It's a tricky situation. My feeling is that the Germans will probably want to take a break and consolidate the front, build some more troops, and as they can pull them out of the cup and get their economy up to total war, rather than do the gamble on the Moscow attack, because the odds would be against them for attacking Moscow, especially if the Soviets move to have military reforms. Okay, so the Soviets are going to indeed go for military reforms. So the posture is going to change. That's a free action. You don't have to roll for it. The Soviets now have no military penalty, but they have a -1 penalty to all political actions, which also stinks, but maybe isn't as bad as the alternative. Okay, now we could pull from the cup, but the Germans are going to interrupt again. They really may as well. So the Germans are going to go ahead and use this flag to increase their commitment. Their commitment is going to go up to total war, which is the highest level. Total war gives a number of benefits. It gives an extra force pool, though it is worth pointing out that the force pools on these cards are not the same as the ones actually used in this scenario. Germany's initial force pool is actually 10 and moves to only 13 here, representing some garrison units in the west. The Soviet pool starts at 13 and moves to 18. So the Soviets will get 5 more units, which is pretty darn good, but Germans will only get 3 more units, which is, well, they need a lot of more units on the board already. So hopefully for them they can get some of those guys out, because they're looking a little light on the army fronts there. In other words, I think the German position here is somewhat fragile, with the Soviets improving their military. Soviets probably going to total war soon. Well, we'll see. So the Germans get to put 3 more counters in their force pool. The force pool is the order of battle in the sense of all the units that you can build. A German logistics unit is pretty tempting here. If that went to Leningrad, they could be very threatening to Moscow. So I will build a logistics. I will put a logistics in the force pool. I will put another army dude in there. And they already have some tank upgrades. They already have 2 tank upgrades in the mix. So I think it's going to be another Air Force for the next element of the force pool. Okay. The Germans also are going to get commitment offensives. This is cool. By moving to total war, they get 1 offensive for every industrial resource they commit, or every industrial resource that they have permanently. Also, they're going to strip Benelux of its remaining resource in order to build another offensive. Because the offensives are just so important at this point. It's really a matter of attack, or else the Germans may run out of momentum. So they'll use up the Benelux limited resource, and they'll tap into the Rhineland and Berlin resources too. That'll give them 3 offensives. 2 of those offensives are going to the Action Cup. 1 of those offensives is going to reserve. So the Germans are likely to use that as soon as possible. Though it won't be possible to immediately interrupt with that because the Germans are going right now and they can't interrupt right after themselves. Yeah. The downside of the home front is that German effectiveness has fallen from 3 to 2. The German political institutions under Hitler are simply less capable of suppressing dissent and getting their, getting the Führer's way done, getting the Führer's will done, I don't know, than they were when the German economy was less geared for war. Soviets are going to have an improved economy as they move to total war because they'll get another resource, but it remains to be seen if they'll actually get there. Yeah, let's find out. So we have to draw from the cup. Oh, a Soviet flag. That is just what they needed. The Soviet flag is going to... Oh boy, this is a tough one because we have to be wary of a German assault on Moscow that could be augmented by 2. So, unfortunately, one option would be to roll for maneuvers with this flag. However, if I rolled for maneuvers and didn't make it, and I have a good chance of not because I'd need at least 1/6 in 2 dice, that would be pretty useless for the Soviets, and they might be doomed because of it. So the Soviets are instead going to use this for a free political action, which is the increasing from commitment of mobilization to mobilization, commitment of mobilization to commitment of total war. That places this guy here in the Ural Mountains, where it can't be touched, and now commitment has increased. So the Soviets are going to get 5 more units in their force pool. That is very welcome for them. They're going to be focusing on... well, let's see what the Soviets have in the mix already. You're not really supposed to do this, but that's a single-player game, so who's going to stop me? Soviets have an army upgrade, 2 army upgrades, an air force, an army, and a fortress in the cup right now. So, let's see. More armies are always useful, so that's 1, 2. More planes are really useful. That's 3. What else do they really want? Yeah, 4th plane isn't a bad idea. The air forces are pretty effective at what they do. And let's get another army upgrade too. This is a pretty straightforward scenario where I'm just saying get all the guns and stuff you can, but I think it's pretty much the Soviet feeling right now, that they need all the arms they can come up with, because they are in a position where, well, Moscow is under real threat, and that means the Soviet project is under an existential threat as well. Okay. That was the Soviet move. Oh, and they'll also get some offensives. 3 industrial resources means 3 offensives. 2 offensives are going to the Action Cup. 1 offensive is coming over here to the reserve, because the Soviets are going to want to counterattack. They may want a couple more units before they do, but they're going to want the option to counterattack when that offensive will give it to them. The Action Cup reflects the last chit that was put into it in this Vassal mod. That doesn't have anything to do with what's coming out of the Action Cup, though. It's at random, I believe. So, Soviets win. Are the Germans going to interrupt? Now, the German interrupt could be a pretty potent move here. They could smash into Ukraine, and they probably would win. They have armor advantage, and they could augment that into the Ukraine. So yeah, let's play that German offensive. I think we need all the Germans need to keep on the attack. So we'll play this German offensive. I'm going to spend 1 military action to invade Ukraine, supporting with 1 plane here. Soviets can't support with anything except the plane that's already in Ukraine. Plane in Ukraine. I'm going to augment this by 1. So the Germans get a +1 combat score. This could be really useful for shooting down that fighter and for hopefully killing that soldier to death, which is going to cause a disaster for the Soviets, and possibly a stability hit, and a flag for the Germans, which would all be great, at least from the German perspective. Okay, so we're going 2 + 1 versus 2 in the air combat. Germans roll 4. Soviets roll 6. Soviets have air superiority because they win the air fight. So the German fighter is going to retreat. It can retreat to Poland, so I may as well do that. Still, the Germans have a fighting chance here because they have armor superiority. So while the Soviets would get 3 dice from air superiority, they're back down to 2 because they lack armor superiority. So it's going to be 2 + 1 versus 2. Germans roll 7, nasty. Soviets roll 4. Oh, that's not quite a triumph. The Soviets only take 1 hit, and they will kind of shrug it off by retreating back to the Donets. Ukraine plane is also going to head to. Let's head it to Belarusia in case we want to attack to the west here. Okay, so that's done. That was two military actions. Thereby netting me Ukraine as the Germans. German victory goes to 10. Soviet victory goes to -2. This is looking grim. And I have one more military action as the Germans. For that final military action, I'm thinking. Yeah, the assault on Leningrad is not likely to succeed, unfortunately. Also the Soviets are going to have a stability hit, and the Germans get a flag for their heroic conquest. Stability hit to the Soviets. Oh, they succeed. Okay, so the Soviets are still wavering. That's better than unstable, to be sure. What are we going to do now? The options are pretty much to redeploy forces. So we could freely redeploy the 2 armies we have, the 2 air forces, and the ship, which isn't a lot, but it might be better than nothing. I guess. Yeah, I'm trying to think here what the best move might be. We could also do a build with that military action. It doesn't seem terribly useful. I guess a build would help, but it's not an immediate build. It just sends something to the cup. Oh, what the hell? Yeah, I'll use the other build to send this to the cup. So I'll send this logistics into the cup, and hope for the best with the Soviet counterattack. Speaking of which, the Soviets have a reserve offensive here. That might be just the thing to, I don't know, get rid of these Leningraders and their Leningrady ways. Leningrad is currently the biggest threat. This tank going unchecked on the southern steppes is pretty bad too, but, And the Soviets are at total war, so their offensives are really good. Soviets would also love some more units, but that just may not happen if the chits don't get pulled. So that logistics thing is really a clear and present danger to the Soviets. They are going to have to sortie in from Moscow with an augmented operation in hopes of driving out the Germans from their territory in the north. So they'll attack from Moscow. We'll be using this operation. They'll offensive for an operation. Attack from Moscow. Support with 2 planes. And they're at full fighting strength. The Germans will get +1 for defending this adverse territory. now that they've conquered Leningrad. However, I think we better augment this too, just to make sure we can really kick off the Germans. So the augmentation is going to be +1. Hopefully that will be a smart move because it could leave. Now killing these units is too important. Let's do +2. We're blowing the whole offensive on this one attack into Leningrad, and it really needed to work. The Soviets really need to kick out the danger here. If the Germans get a logistics unit down here, that might be it, because they'll be able to attack with no supply penalty, and it'll be really ugly. Okay, so the Germans can trace supply to Leningrad. They couldn't trace supply through Leningrad, but they are supplied here in Leningrad, so they're not going to receive a supply penalty. Okay, let's do the air war first. Soviets are going to roll 2+2. Germans are going to roll 2. Soviets roll 3. Germans roll 3. So that means one plane of each kills each other. Not the worst, because attrition is sort of on the Soviet side out here. So, and we still have air superiority, so Soviets are likely to still win this battle. 3 Russian die +2 for air superiority versus 2 German dice +1 for adverse terrain. 3 + 2 makes 5 here. 3 dice +2 makes 5. The Germans roll 2 + 1. Oh, and they also get a 5. Ooh, that's... Well, it's not the worst outcome, because that does eliminate all the German troops. Because it's a tie, nobody can retreat. So they just have to kill each other off. The plane here is going to go back to Smolensk in case of... oh boy, this is nasty. The Germans are really overstretched, but they're deep into Soviet territory. The Soviets don't have a lot of guys left. And the Germans are about to pull a flag, which they could use for maneuvers. Okay. Unfortunately, the Soviets failed to liberate their own territory here. It's still under German control, because they couldn't... if they'd had a land unit left standing, they would have taken it, but no dice there. Okay, so now the Germans have the option to interrupt again. Germany is down to... not a lot of good stuff here. I think the Germans are going to take a chit and hope for the best. Oh, it's a flag. Okay, so what can the Germans do with this flag here? As a political action, they could... they can't increase their commitment. They could not really do propaganda, because they're already steady, so I guess the only option is maneuvers. So the Germans will roll for maneuvers with this flag. They make it. Germans get 1 military action. In my opinion, the priority for Germany is to press the attack, even if it means losing some territory. I am going to deploy this tank up to Leningrad, and this plane up to Leningrad. And we may be able to take Moscow with an offensive lucky draw. The Soviets have nothing in reserve. The Germans can't interrupt after themselves, so we draw another chit. Oh, an army. That's nice for me. Yeah, that'll be deployed to the Ukraine. I can't send it to Leningrad because it's already overstacked there. If I could draw those logistics, man, I'd be set. We'll have to draw again here. Hey, logistics. Well, that's a good news. This means that Leningrad is no longer restricted territory as long as that logistics unit stays there. The Germans don't have a supply penalty for attacks out of Leningrad, and they would have the ability to stack 2 units there. If I'd drawn this army before, I would have stacked it. Okay, now the Germans just need to break through with an offensive. So if they can draw an offensive, they can hit Moscow and probably crush it. Ah, Soviet flag. This is maneuvers, probably. Well, maneuvers isn't likely. I mean, propaganda is probably a better choice for the Soviets because it would let them theoretically survive a loss of Moscow. Not great, but maybe better than nothing until we can get some of those units out. Oh boy. Okay. Soviets attempt propaganda. Soviets get to roll 3, but they have to roll a 6. 3 dice, but they have to roll a 6 to make propaganda. They fail. They get a cube of shame, which allows them better odds next time if they do propaganda again. German flag. Germans could do maneuvers, but well, maybe they should. Let's see, what else could the Germans do? Yeah, the Germans are going to attempt maneuvers with their flag. I mean, it's in reserve. You may as well. They succeed in maneuvers. Uh-oh. Okay, that gives them 1 military action. And I think you know what we're going to use that for. The invasion of Moscow. Well, this is grim for the Soviets, who can support with only 1 air unit. These are evenly matched. There's no DRM to either side. So it's 2v2. 2 Germans, they roll 3. Soviets roll a 4. Good news for them. The German Air Force has to retreat. That means that, okay, so the nominal defense force in Moscow has only 1 die normally. They would get 2 from having air superiority, but it goes back down to 1 for having no armor superiority. Actually, the Germans have armor superiority. So Germans are rolling 2 dice. The Soviets are rolling 1. Oh, and the Germans whiff it with a 1-1. Oh, the Soviets blow it up 6-1. That means 6 casualties. Obviously, this tank can only receive 2 casualties. So this is a disaster for the Germans. It couldn't have come at a better time because the poor Soviets, they get a flag and maybe they'll even get Leningrad back. Okay, so this plane has to this plane doesn't have to retreat, but it will. This tank is destroyed. That's a big blow to the Germans, who now have a pretty lousy set of forces here, and nothing in reserve. The Soviets get a flag for this triumph. The Germans get a stability check with 2. Oh, and the Germans lose stability. Okay. Yeah, if Germany were to collapse, I guess it wouldn't end the war, but it would be pretty bad. They could collapse based on military failure alone. It's not unheard of. Okay. So the Soviets could use their flag to interrupt. They will do propaganda again. 2d6 plus 1 makes 3 plus 4 plus 1 is 5. Not high enough, unfortunately, because it's -1 with military forms. So they get another cube of shame. Okay. Now what? Well, let's check out the scenario here. Both sides are down to a pittance of units. That's 2 armies and a plane for the Soviets, while the Germans have 1 army way out of position and 1 plane and that logistics, which is not doing much right now, is it? Okay, well, let's see what happens. A crisis. So the world is in war. We'll roll the crisis table. We get a 6-2. Oh, that's a communist coup. That's interesting. So the Soviets get to perform a diplomacy attempt against an ungarrisoned country of their choice, but these Germans would get an opportunity if they fail. So the Soviets have no chance of. Soviets have really no chance of getting any country that has a German cube or any resistance. That leaves, unfortunately, Albania or Bulgaria as the only real ones that the Soviets could get into. And they would need a 6 either way out of 2 dice, which is unlikely. But they can't say no to this, so I guess it's Bulgaria. No good. The Germans now get a free diplomatic opportunity against Bulgaria, which they'll roll 2 for, and they also whiff it. Okay, so Bulgaria remains blissfully neutral. The crisis marker goes to the next turn, and then we pull a German flag. Germans are going to... I don't know. They might abandon their position in the Ukraine, send these troops up here, and then pray for an offensive. Yeah, let's try that. Okay, they'll try maneuvers. Germans, they fail maneuvers. Send to available. Germans get a cube of shame on maneuvers. Not what they wanted there. That's the Soviet home front. Now, the Soviet home front would be an opportunity for the Soviets to... it would be an opportunity where the Soviets could change their posture, but they've already changed it this turn, so that's not possible. So it'll just be a redeploy after the nasty stability test. Okay, so they do 2d6 for the home front because it's a little different than the regular stability test, which they would get 3 dice for due to their special power. 2d6 minus 2. Oh, that is bad. That is really bad. Soviets rolled a 2 on that test, and that's minus 2. The only roll in Cataclysm that can go below 1 is the home front test. And if it does, the Soviets lose 2 levels of their stability. That puts the Soviets at immediate collapse, with risk of surrender altogether. The Soviets move to collapse. Okay. The collapse procedure, which I will look up right here, first has you roll a surrender die. This is a 1d against a surrender threshold. Soviet surrender threshold is 2 for the occupation, plus 1 because they have less than 0 points. 0 or fewer points, I should say. So the Soviets are going to roll 1d. If it's 3 or less, they surrender, and the game is over. If not, they get to continue fighting, albeit with a more difficult set of parameters. Oh, and they make it. So the Soviet Union survives this terrible collapse. Maybe Stalin is out of power, who knows? This game doesn't do that kind of granular stuff, but the Soviet Union has, at the least, had a terrible reorganization. So a collapse is not a surrender, but let's see. Germans get a flag because the enemy collapsed. Any stability tests are canceled, and the stability is set to wavering. The power's commitment is total war, so they're moving to exhaustion, unfortunately. So the Soviets are now at the less advantageous position of exhaustion. That stinks because they're going to have to throw away 5 units because they're going back to the mobilization force pool, and their offensives are worse, and their home front is still really, really dire. So the Soviet situation is going from worse to worser. They'll get rid of a useless fleet. They'll get rid of 1 plane, 2 plane, or one army, so that's 3, and then they'll get rid of I guess another army and another plane. Boy, they're in some poo poo now. Let's see, this should be flipped over. Yeah, this is bad. Bad. Okay. Soviets don't control any Oh, they lose their propaganda cubes to add insult to injury. They would lose a reserve if they had one. They could lose ungarrisoned countries if they had any outside of Soviet Union. And what else happens? They would have to offer an armistice, but there's no armistice allowed in this scenario. So we are fighting to the death. Oh boy. That is pretty bad news for the Soviet Union. Well, let's do, let's put this home front here, and let's do a German flag. Germans are going to try maneuvers again. So they have an advantage because they have this cube here. Germans get, they rolled 7, and they get a cube for a total of 8 when they needed 5. Great. I'm going to relocate this dude to Leningrad. The hope here is that I can do a decisive blow to Moscow, knock them out for good. Because the Germans are pretty overstretched here, and it could turn bad for them quickly. All right. So it's getting offensive. A direly needed offensive. Okay. The options here are to redeploy. They could redeploy, like, 2 troops to Moscow, but that hardly seems that smart. They could invade from Belarusia to Leningrad, and with the hope of knocking this guy out. With an augmentation of 1, that puts them at about even odds with the defenders in the adverse terrain. Losing Moscow might be okay. I mean, but it would be pretty bad. We don't want to risk that if we can help it. Another interesting possibility is an air operation, which I haven't done in this game yet. But that's where airplanes go after airplanes, and that's it. No, that's a waste of the offensive. Okay, we'll use the offensive on Leningrad. We're going to augment by 1. Going in from Belarusia. Support from Smolensk. And the Soviets are going to need to pray to Marx or whatever they pray to in their godless, I don't know, communism thing. Okay, so 2 plus 1 versus 2 for the air war. 5 makes a 6, and 6. So the Soviet and German air forces are now completely destroyed because they tied each other and shot each other down. So it's going to be 2 plus 1 versus 2 plus 1. And this is going to be a desperate battle. 5 plus 1 makes 6 for the Soviets. And 6 plus 1 makes 7 for the Leningrad defenders. So that's pretty bad news. I'm going to check here to see what the retreat rules are saying. Yeah, this unit can retreat from Belarusia to Moscow, even though it originally originated in Moscow. So that's a saving grace that they can have some defense in Moscow, and they probably won't lose immediately. But who knows? Okay. So no flags there because there was no triumph or tragedy, no triumph or disaster. Pull an offensive. Okay. The Germans, oh, what the hell? They'll just go nuts with this. They go in the whole hog, and they gotta knock the Soviets out while they still have a chance. The Soviets can't be allowed to rebuild, and even if they do, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. But okay, they're gonna go nuts with this one. Offensive to Moscow, augmentation plus 2. There are no planes left on the map, so it's just this guy fighting this guy to the death. So 2 plus 2 for the Germans makes 6. Soviets roll 6. The desperate defense succeeds as both the units are killed. Now the Germans' only unit on the board is the logistics and the fleet. All right, well, this has been eventful. Yes, it has. Let's see if there are some units that would like to come out and play, because, okay, Civil War resolution, there are any Civil Wars. Tank upgrade, yeah, sure. So the Soviets will upgrade their only guy to a tank. Let's see what else we got. Another crisis. This crisis is 4-4, which is Civil War Colonial Revolt. Okay, so I'm going to roll 2 dice and see if this matters. It's in Jordan, which is out of play, so yeah, no one cares. That was the second crisis, right? Yeah. Okay. We draw a Soviet offensive. That's good news for the Soviets, because they can push all the way into Germany with that thing. Yeah, they can. Okay, so they'll attack the Ukraine. This is going to be 2 versus 1-1 for their first attack. They can't push into Germany because they only have 2 military actions, but this could be good for them. 2 versus 1-1. 2, so that's 5, and 1-1 is 3. All right. They triumph in the Ukraine. They also get their territory back, so they grab a flag. The Germans have lost a cube, so the German situation is not looking as well as it was. And the Soviets still have military action here. They'll probably, they could go after Romania to take away that. Well, they could go after Romania. Their chances are a little worse, and Poland is really more threatening to the Germans. Yeah, we'll send them into Poland next. Same deal here. It's 2 versus 1-1. So that's because the Germans have no defenders, so they roll 1 die, and they can't be reduced to 0 dice, but they are reduced to 1 die -1. Let's do this. So the Soviets roll an abysmal 2. Oh no, abysmal 1. And the Germans roll a 6. That means 5 modified German defense and 1 modified Soviet attack. So that's 5 casualties. That's a disaster for the Soviets and a triumph for the Germans, which is an interesting reversal. That knocks the last Soviet army off the map. So there are no land units besides that logistics unit even left on the board. Obviously, that's going to be the end of offensives for a little while. Anyway, this is just some bizarre outcomes from the dice here. Soviets suffer a stability check. They lose 1 stability. They're close to out of here. The Germans are going to get a flag from that. Okay. What now? Germany is going to hang on to the flag. Just draw a chit. Okay, so a red plane that goes here. Let's see. Could Germany do anything useful with that flag? They could do propaganda that might help them. They could, and that plane isn't capturing anything by itself, so there's not really a risk there. Yeah, let's, if they did maneuvers, that'd be pretty useless. I guess they could do 1 build. Actually, that might not be the worst idea, because the Germans have lost a lot of dudes. Alright, they'll do maneuvers with their reserve. 2d6. That's a 3-6, so that's successful. So they'll send 1 army to the Action Cup. They'll send 1 army to their reserve, actually. So they'll get able to play that as soon as they can. Soviets are probably going to want to... they're definitely going to want to play their reserve for propaganda. It's unfortunate they still need a 6 to do it, but if they collapse again, that seems pretty bad. All right, they'll send this to available. 2 for propaganda. Oh boy, no. Okay. And now the Germans are up. They're going to deploy their reserve immediately to Leningrad. And, yeah. All right. The Soviets finally drew their fortress, which was badly needed. This will stave off the defenders from Moscow, at least for now. So the Leningrad army is supplied, but it would have to face a +1 DRM against the Soviets if it attacked here. So it's possible that fortress will hold up. It would be better for the Soviets if they had air support and another army there, though. Crisis. The crisis is congressional investigation. The United States is not in this game, so we don't care about that. Was that the last crisis? No, there's one more left. Okay. Red Army. Perfect. Oops. No reserves, so we'll pull another. Ooh, that's nasty for Soviets, because Germans will upgrade their only army to a tank. Another crisis. So the Germans still have 5 chits left. If they have 4 or more while they're at total war, the game goes on, even if you draw the 4th crisis. So I'll put that back in the cup. Germans, they can't use this at all. That's nasty. They'll put this in reserve. Germans getting defensive. Okay. Everything rides on this German offensive now. They're going to go for Moscow, and they're going to go hard. +2. Augmentation with a tank, and that's it. The tank has supply because it was supplied in Leningrad. The Germans have armor superiority. That gives them 2 dice versus 1 Russian die. The Russians have a fortress. That gives them +1 DRM. Oh, and the Germans are at 2 DRM, so that's pretty nasty. 2 + 2. The Germans score a 4. The Soviets score a 4. Oh, interesting. So the Soviets get a choice of... the Germans are going to have to take that 1 hit to their tank, and the tank has to retreat. The Soviets get to choose which to destroy. I don't really know here. I mean, I guess the army can be replaced pretty easily. I hope. Okay. And that will probably help Moscow's defense. Yeah. This goes back to available. This is deleted. Okay, now what? Crisis. And that will be the final crisis of this turn, because the Germans only have 3 left. So that crisis ends the turn. You don't actually play the crisis, it just ends. We'll pull this plane into the German holding box. This tank into the Soviet holding box. I'm doing this out of order. So we still have the German home front to care about. The Germans could whiff this all and collapse themselves. So we'll see. Germans roll 2d6 on the home front for stability. 2d6 minus 2. Oh, they rolled a 6, but that's not good enough. So the Germans are now unstable as well. So, to sum up, the Germans have taken over most of Europe, but are almost exhausted of manpower. The Soviets are in even worse economic shape, but have managed to do a last-ditch defense that, to my surprise, has held up. Germans still have the advantage here. If they can just wait until 4 Allied offensives are played next turn, they will win by points, even without forcing a Russian surrender. Okay. So on to the next turn, which is the last turn. We'll put this turn counter on the 1943 thingy. All right. So Germany gets 2 flags. Soviets would have to suffer a stability test to gain a flag, and that's out of the question right now, because they're in military form, so that's not going to happen. So the Germans have a fighter and 3 flags, and Soviets in their production holding have a flag and a tank upgrade. Cool. Production time. Soviets. Oh, and the Germans are now at 2 effectiveness, but that's still higher than the Soviets. So that wouldn't have changed anything because fascists count as effectiveness higher than Soviets, even if it was in the communists, even if they're at the same level, just due to the way this chart is laid out. Okay, Soviet Union. They are at 4 resources. They have an exhaustion of. They have a rate of 1 to 2, so that would give them 8 total builds, or 6 in an offensive, or oh boy, this is ugly for them. Well, they definitely need some guys, and they have this tank at the ready. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and an offensive. Let's put the flag into their reserve because they'll use that for propaganda. So the Germans can see what the Soviets have done. That's all open information here. So the Germans now have a total war economy. They have 3 resources, giving them a total of 9 builds. And they need to knock. If they're gonna win by knockout, there needs to be fast here because there are 4 allied offensives. There are 6 allied offensives there. Once the 4th one is drawn, that's good. GG. Good game. So there is a chance that the Germans could just launch an offensive with this guy and still win using augmentation. So they will buy 1 offensive for that purpose. Oh, and this should go back to reserves. Yeah. I'm gonna put this. Okay. So they have a fighter and a tank upgrade on deck, whereas the Soviets have a lot of armies and planes and a tank upgrade. 9 resources, eh? Okay, let's do 9 builds, eh? So this is 1, 2, 3. Oops, that's 3 and 4. 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 1 offensive from 1 resource. Soviets, no. Yeah, let's just hang on to this offensive and use it for a crazy attack. There's also war offensives that I didn't think about. Because both powers are at war, they gain offensives at the beginning of the turn. So, Soviets are going to gain 1, 2, 3 industrial resources. They gain 3 offensives. Whereas the Germans have 2 industrial resources and will gain 2 offensives. Still, that's a hell of a lot of offensives. Okay. Drop that all in the cup. Drop that all in the cup. I think the Germans are just going to go for the desperate attack on Moscow. See if they can win this on points. If they lose badly, they could collapse themselves. But they won't surrender, at least. Oh, God. Okay, so we're going to put this in the action. We're going to send this to available. Send it to here, actually. We're going to augment by 2. And we're going to send 1 lone trooper into Moscow. I like to imagine this just represents 2 guys. Though I think it actually represents thousands of guys. Anyway, so commies are at 2 plus 1. Germans are at 2 plus 2. Okay, 2 plus 2 makes 6. Soviet roll is 5 plus 1. That's 6 as well. So they each lose a land unit here because they're tied. So these are both going back to the force pool. Moscow is safe again for now. And the German position in Leningrad is quite exposed, except that the Soviets have no real way to attack it. Okay, Soviets are going to do propaganda. Let's see. And they could change their military stance, but I don't think they're going to. They're going to do some propaganda here. Ah, they make it. They make it. So the Soviets are now a little more stable. Okay, let's see what we get. Crisis. Crisis 4-2 is affects the UK only, so we don't care. This doesn't matter what we do with it because it's not coming in the game again. That's the first Allied offensive. That represents the surrender of Italy. So Italy has been invaded by the Allies, and Germany has to take a stability check. That could kill Germany by itself. Let's see if that does. Germany makes it. Germany makes it. So that's one offensive out of the 4 that will make this game over. Crisis 2. That's 6-4. Well, this is a UK choice, so I think we'll assume that doesn't happen because the UK is not in this game. A red army, and not too soon, because the Soviets are just at a terrible disadvantage here. They need to. Boy, they're in a bad way because they have to make up so many points. Germans are at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 still, while the Soviets are at a -1. That's a differential of 10 points, and it may be too much for them to make up, but they can try. Okay, Belarusia, cool. German offensive. Well, not a lot they're going to be doing with that, huh? Not a lot of offensive action they can take. I guess I could move this fleet around. Yeah, so they'll use that for 3 builds. 3 builds. So one build is going to be this army. Another build is going to be into the Action Cup, an army. And a third build is going to... I could use that for a deployment or whatever, but there's nothing to deploy. So a third build is going to plane. Okay. The Germans would love to deploy that thing, but they can't because they just gotten defensive. So, Soviet offensive, great. Soviets need to rack up all the points they can. I mean, that's just where it is right now. The Soviets could win if they take 5 countries off the Germans, which is a tall order for this country at exhaustion, but could happen. I think the targets would have to be Baltics, Leningrad, maybe. The adverse terrain makes it pretty nasty. I don't know. The Leningrad is just a dagger at the Soviet heart. Okay, so we're gonna attack Leningrad with no augmentation. That's gonna be 3 versus 1 + 1. 3 makes 6, and 1 makes 6. Shit. All right, they have to retreat. All right, they didn't lose anything. That's good. I'll do the same thing again with the second military action. 6. Okay, they roll a 6 again. The Germans are rolling at +1, 1 + 1. They roll a 1. German disaster. Actually, the Germans don't have disaster since they don't have any land units to take the disaster, but they do lose Leningrad big time. And they lose this logistics unit. And the Soviets have gained 1 flag for that triumph and 1 flag for returning their home territory. Soviets are now at 0 points, while the Germans are at 8. If the Soviets can take 4 more countries back, they win. Still a tall order. Okay. Germany is going to immediately... Well, they just want to play defensively at this point. So, okay, they'll play this guy to Poland. Soviets are going to... what can they do with that flag? Rolling for maneuvers is very inefficient here because it only has a 3 low chance of success. Oh, and this should be in the Action Cup. This should be available. So, Soviets, do they want to take that flag option or not? Well, you might as well just try for the maneuvers. I mean, it's a long shot, but it's better than nothing. Oh, Soviets fail. They get a cue of shame in maneuvers. But we'll see if Germany has some... Okay, so that was the... that's the second of the offensives. No effect from that. Or from the third one, but the fourth is GG. Okay, German troopers. Oh, this is looking grim for the Soviets. A German flag. They need the propaganda boost more than anything. I think. So the Germans will roll for propaganda and fail it. Getting here, because the Germans are unstable as well, which could be a big problem. The Germans have no possibility of surrendering yet, unless they had some occupation of their home territory, but it still would be bad for them if they were forced to exhaustion. Soviets, or whoever is up now. Okay, it's the third offensive. Dun dun dun. Okay, red flag. Yeah, they'll roll for maneuvers again. Oh, fails. Alright, that's probably it for Soviets. Here's a Soviet offensive. Well, couldn't have come at a better time. Alright, they'll attack Baltic states. No augmentation. 3 versus 2. 3 and 2. Ah, crap. That's a disaster for the Soviets. They lose 2, and they can only absorb 1. So the plane will survive and go to Belarusia, but the... oops, wrong place to put that. The Germany gets a flag for their triumph, and Soviets get a stability check for their disaster. Soviets, they passed the stability check. There's one more military action from this. I should have done augmentation, but that would have been smart. But I'll use the other military action for putting a dude in my reserve. Okay, Germany is going to... Yeah, they'll roll for propaganda again. What the hell? Propaganda. Okay, they make it that time, because they have +1 from... that. Actually, it wouldn't have mattered, but... so Germany's back up to wavering, and let's see if this game's over yet. Not quite. Soviets interrupt. They'll put a guy in Leningrad. Boy, this is some dire straits for the Soviets. Do the Germans want to interrupt with that flag? I don't think so. I don't think it matters much. Alright, the German home front is here. Germany could collapse here. Hopefully they won't for the Germans. Alright, they roll a 6. That's -2, so they lose a stability point, but they're okay. And they get to redeploy, too, to boot. So, yeah. I think I'll send this plane down to Poland, but that's all the redeployment I really need. Or you know what? I might even put these armies together for a bigger bang. What the hell? All right. Plane. Crisis. So that was the third crisis, right? Is there another crisis? Yeah. This crisis is 6-1. A fascist coup. Interesting. Germany must perform a diplomacy attempt against an ungarrisoned country of its choice, regardless of interest. And then there's a fascist opportunity to counter diplomacy if needed. So they'll go for I guess they'll go for Bulgaria. Everyone wants Bulgaria. Okay, they make it. So Germans grab Bulgaria and are doing even better. The Germans are going to play their flag for propaganda. They make it. And what else do we got? Germany upgrade. So tank time here. Oh, and here's the last last offensive. So that's 4 offensives out of the Allied offensives. And according to the rules, what that means is D-Day has happened. However, the Germans are in a great position for 1944. I mean, historically, they would be pretty well equipped to I don't know, assuming the Western forces weren't totally under-equipped, they might be able to pull off a win anyway. And the Soviets are in pretty bad shape. I mean, it'd be fun to keep playing this game, but it's over. So there you go. Let's see, lessons learned from this little adventure. One is that, well, the Soviet Union is resilient. In a test game I played, when the Germans conquered Leningrad, Belarusia, and Ukraine, that was enough to knock the Soviets down to surrender. But that's an unlikely result. It does seem to me that Germany has quite an advantage in this scenario due to all the extra cubes here. And I'm pretty sure we just check, unless I've got something super wrong here, it looks like we just check who has the most VP. Yeah, and clearly it's Germany. Soviets are at 0 VP, and Germans are at 9, controlling most of Europe. Well, GG, Nazis. Yeah. I don't know. This doesn't prove anything. It's just a game, but anyway, I do appreciate you watching this. I'm going to try and do some scenarios with a little more complexity. So I might do the Days of Decision scenario next, or that involves the run-up to war between Germany and France and Italy and the UK. A little more involved because of some naval operations and the diplomatic necessities. So that might be kind of cool. Yeah, but that's it for now. If you did make it this far, well, thank you for watching.